Chapter 18. It was snowing as I left the Baika, large, soft flakes that floated down so lazily you could follow each one individually. I walked to the Nevsky, the snow falling faster, caught on my eyelids, turning the globes of the streetlights into stars which sparkled magically in the darkness above Leningrad's great main street. Traffic was quiet, and the snow hissed softly in the stillness. Then, 2 blocks away, a trolley clattered through an intersection, the row of colored lights on the cab, visible even in the worst blizzard, proclaiming its route. On the sidewalk, a thin stream of people passed by. These were bureaucrats hurrying home from number 41, the Leningrad Party headquarters, or clerks from the Gostchiny Dvor department store, which had just closed up, or students, wrapped in scarves, leaving the old imperial library. Heads bowed before the prospect of coming winter, and thickly clothed in the resolute silence of Russians in mass, they trickled into the metro stops. Standing there, watching them, I thought over what Loganov had told me. Did I believe him? Was there really a Russian dissent within the Soviet Union, a dissent that might truly matter? In a way, I thought, this street proved his words. The Bolsheviks had tried to rename the Nevsky Avenue of the 25th of October, but it just hadn't stuck, and a lot else hadn't stuck either. Since 1917, Russia had come a great distance, but so had the rest of the world. Relatively little had changed. She was the real sick man of Europe, with a vast rebellious empire, a desperately backward economy, and a cruelly repressive government. I lifted my eyes. In the distance, framed by the long perspective of the trefoil street lamps, the sharp golden spike of the Admiralty Tower was brilliantly lit up by spotlights. It had been the city's symbol 100 years before Lenin arrived at the Finland station, and its presence now seemed only to mock what he had done. The revolution had been an illusion, but then so was Soviet Russia itself. For Brightman and a million others in his generation, it had been a Shangri-La existing only on the maps of their minds. For Hamilton, it had been a secret stage on which he could act out the fantasies of his own puny power, and for Subotin, a new purity, the true home of the Slavic soul, a spiritual path between the materialism of the West and the ant-hill order of the East. Yes, I could believe it, yet the more I thought about it, the more I felt that this wasn't the real importance of Loganov's message. Not for me, not now. Subotin's motives were fascinating, but not immediately relevant, and I didn't need anyone to tell me that the man was a killer. Indeed, as I walked along, it was the manner rather than the substance of what Loganov had said that struck me as crucial. It was extraordinary when you thought about it. He'd been so cautious, so circumspect. He'd offered me information and advice, but he wasn't a professor of Soviet studies or Dear Abby. He was a KGB officer, and in the middle of Leningrad, a KGB officer shouldn't have the least reason for caution. If he wanted something, he'd just give the order, and if you didn't obey, he'd stick you in jail or put you on the next plane back home. Except he hadn't done that. He'd played games, and I thought I knew why. May Brightman, Florence Raines, Dr. Charlie, Dimitrov, Nick Barry, Hamilton, all the separate elements I'd discovered circled one central point: Harry Brightman and Harry Brightman's gold. This was obviously the resource Subotin was seeking, but Harry Brightman had been a KGB agent, or, if that wasn't quite the right expression, a KGB asset, which raised an interesting question. If Harry Brightman had buried the treasure, who had told Subotin where he should dig? There was only one possible answer. Even if Subotin and his tendency were rooted in the Soviet military, they must have had good lines into the KGB. There was no other way they could have got on to Brightman in the first place. Once you granted that, Loganov's peculiar approach made sense. It implied that there was dissent, or at least ambiguity, within the KGB itself as to how they should handle Subotin, and that was the crucial point, so far as I was concerned. It meant I had a certain amount of freedom, but it also imposed some crucial restraints. Subotin had allies, and they were in high places, and once they got on to me, they could come down hard. So I had to move fast. It was now or never. If I was going ahead, I had to disappear in a puff of smoke and get in and out of Pavagnets before anyone noticed. Or at least that's what I was thinking as I reached the Narodny most, the People's Bridge over the Mica. And to give myself credit, once I'd reached this conclusion, I did things right. Assuming I was under surveillance, I tried to appear perfectly normal. I was okay so far. I was following a reasonable route back to the hotel, and now I stopped, lit a cigarette, and looked casually down the bridge. The Mica is the smallest of the three rivers. The others are the Great Neva and the Fontanka, which flow through Leningrad. It was only beginning to freeze, and the wind slithering white snakes of snow across a skin of shiny black ice. Winter was setting its teeth. Still, it wasn't too cold for a walk, especially if a KGB officer had just given you something to think about. So I crossed the street and went down to the southern embankment. The wind was brisker here. The few people around hurried along, wrapped in their own shadows, the snow crunching under their boots. But even though I turned up my collar, I still kept to a slow pace, like a man deep in thought, as opposed to one who's made up his mind. Keeping on, I went past all the old dark mansions and palaces that are now institutes and academies, then paused again, looking across to the opposite bank in order to admire the silver cap of snow on St. Isaac's golden cupola. I smoked one more cigarette there, studiously, didn't look back. Then, turning away, apparently becoming conscious of the cold, I shoved my hands deep into my pockets, put my head down against the wind, and set off more quickly, but like a man who just wants to get warm, as opposed to one who's about to do something rash. Beyond the blue bridge is an old footbridge, with my steps ringing on the ancient iron I crossed over. On this side, the embankment merged with Ulitsa Girtsina. Doubling back and crossing the wide square in front of St. Isaac's, I soon reached the hotel. Downstairs, I also took my time. I bought 2 packs of cigarettes, a copy of Pravda, and left a wake-up call at the desk. Then I rode the elevator up to my floor. As in all Russian hotels, the Astoria has separate night clerks on each floor, old ladies who keep an eye on the guests, the staff, and otherwise get in the way. I passed a few words with mine, asking her how long the bar stayed open, and then went on to my room. It was now 11:25. I washed my face and spruced myself up. A fresh shirt, a different tie, a navy blazer I'd bought from Montreal. The total effect was nothing fancy, but at least respectable. Now I laid my coat out on the bed. It was an aquascutum raincoat, not very warm, but it had a zip-in lining that now proved handy. Opening it up, I packed away a couple of shirts, a sweater, and a pair of socks, then stuffed it into a pillowcase and put my boots in on top. Knotted up, this made a fancy version of a hobo's satchel. Next, I got a towel from the bathroom. Doubling it around my hand, I gave the window a couple of hard raps, cracking the glass. It was a sealed, double-glazed unit. With my penknife, I opened up the cracks, then wiggled the pieces of glass away from the plastic. I was able to manage all this very quietly. Even if my room had looked out onto a main street, I don't think anyone would have noticed. As it was, I was at the back facing another building. When the hole was big enough, I pushed my bundle out. It disappeared in the darkness, and I didn't even hear it land. Midnight. I stepped into the hall, walked along to the elevators. The night clerk saw me, but that was okay. She also saw that I wasn't dressed to go out, and she already knew I was off to the bar. And that's where I went. It was old, rather gloomy, a fuzzy imitation of a British club. The room was already pretty full, and more people began to come in as I did, for Leningrad closes up around midnight. Only the Western hotels, like the Astoria, staying open late, and even they were only open till 2. I sat at a table with a Danish designer of injection molds and 2 German patent attorneys. They were drinking number 1, a decent Russian white wine. I followed suit and bought us a bottle, and after a couple of glasses it was Sven, Dieter, and Bob. I never did catch the second German's name. They all knew Leningrad well. We traded stories, compared notes. Around 1 o'clock, two more Germans joined us, also attorneys. There was some sort of international conference, and a few minutes later one of them asked us all back to his room for a nightcap. I declined, saying I was too tired, but went with them as far as the elevators. Then I headed straight for the lobby, and 2 minutes later was out on the street. No one had noticed my departure. The clerk on my floor would assume she'd just missed my return, and that I was back in my room. With luck, I wouldn't be missed till the next day. Outside, the snow was still falling, but now, wind-driven, it fell in sharp, slanting streaks. And of course, it took me a good 10 minutes to find that alley. Somehow, the world looked very different down here than it had from my window. But finally, shaking with cold, I blundered into it and found the pillowcase. Shivering, hopping about on one foot, I got into my boots and then put on the raincoat. It worked all right, though I had to cinch the belt tight to stop all the stuff I'd packed inside from slipping down to the hem. The alley appeared to serve no purpose. There weren't even trash cans. At the far end, a spill of light glistened on the street, but there was no sign that anyone had followed me. I made my way out. Now I walked directly to my car, which was now parked about 2 blocks away. For although this was downtown Leningrad, one of the great virtues of Soviet cities is that you can park virtually anywhere, anytime. Indeed, I could only see one other vehicle parked on that block. I got into mine. The cold engine coughed, pushing at the heavy weight of the oil in the crankcase, then kicked over, falling into a ragged, faltering idle. Letting it warm and trying to warm myself, I lit a cigarette and looked down the street. At the far end, there was a glow from St. Isaac's, and a block beyond this a taxi passed by, probably on its way to the Leningradskaya, another hotel just behind the Astoria. But nothing else moved, just the snow slicing down through the glow of the street lights. So if I was being watched, it was being done very well, and in fact I doubted that I was. Except in Moscow, there is so little traffic in Russian cities that you can't possibly follow another car without giving yourself away, and though that might be a useful intimidation tactic, Loganov had already passed on the chance to intimidate me much more directly. All the same, I knew the car was the weak link. It was too easy to trace. For the time being, I'd disappeared into thin air, but now I had to pull the same trick with it. I turned on the headlights. The Ziguli, a Russian Fiat, is no better than the original. With a grind and a clunk, it finally agreed to go into gear. Slowly I rolled down the street, inspecting that other car, but it was empty, the wind building a ramp of snow up its windshield. Hitting the gas, I made for the Nevsky, reached it, but quickly turned off, cutting in behind the Gostiny Dvor. I knew Leningrad like the back of my hand, and now that was no small advantage. Above all, no one watching me drive, the militia, for example, would ever have guessed that I was a foreigner. Following Kirovsky Prospect, I crossed the islands that the Neva carves out as it flows into the Gulf of Finland, and then turned into Novaya Derevnya, the old country house district on the far side. Here, without incident, I pulled into service station number 3. A combination garage and filling station, it was fairly large, like one of those interstate truck stops you see in the West. But it was the standard Soviet type. Several islands dispensing various grades of benzene, and a cinder block building with an old woman behind a slot in the window. Snow swirled like moths in the cones of light over the pumps, and a service vehicle was hectically clearing an area of the back of the lot. Since there are only a few gas stations in Leningrad, and fewer still are open all night, they were doing good business. Cars, trucks, transports, and a couple of snowplows jockeyed for position, their engines chugging with the fat, bubbly sound that comes from low-octane gas. I got into line behind an ancient Skoda, and walked up to the booth with its driver when our turn came. "Not a good night?" he said. "If it gets any worse, I will stop in Novgorod," I replied, "at my cousin's." Your car is new, though very nice. Yes, but it would feel better in Italy. He laughed and went inside. I paid for 20 liters, then trotted briskly back to the car. In Russian gas stations, you pay the attendant for the gas. Then she usually dials it up on a sort of telephone gadget which turns the hose on, the sudden jolt of pressure frequently spraying your purchase all over the place. But in this case my run was purely for form. Intourist had given me a full tank. So much of what I'd bought was spilled anyway. When I was finished, I put the hose back and pulled over to one side of the lot. I was still in the light here, but at the very edge of its arc, and as cars and trucks moved in and out of the service area, they hid me from anyone inside the booth. I went around and opened the hood. The oily warmth of the engine swelled up at my face, and the snow hissed on the block. I checked the dipstick. It was fine. I wiggled the battery connections. Terrific. But then, apparently discovering something wrong, I returned to the car and came out with the tool kit. Taking out a screwdriver and a pair of pliers, I fussed for a couple of minutes, adjusting the idle until it was absolutely the same as I'd found it. Then, leaving the hood up, I got back in the car, sitting in the front seat, but leaving the door open and keeping both feet outside on the ground. I lit a cigarette. 5 minutes passed. Traffic, mainly trucks, kept pulling into the station. As they came up to the pumps, their powerful headlamps shone right at my little car, stretching a long wedge of shadow behind it. When I ground out my cigarette and stepped into the darkened patch, I must have been almost invisible. I worked around the service area. The snow had been cleared here, but the bays were dark and locked. Beyond them, extending out from the back of the building, was a metal fence. I probably could have got over this easily, but I didn't have to. There was a gate, and the padlock was broken. I just pushed hard to shift the snow behind it and stepped away quickly through. I looked around. I was on a small asphalt lot, where they kept the cars that were waiting to go in for repairs. Parked in 2 rows, they were now being buried under a blanket of snow. Behind them, bringing back a faint echo of that day in Detroit, was a junkyard, piles of tires, but chained together. A lot of twisted scrap, one old door jutting up like a broken wing, and a tangled heap of exhaust pipes sticking up through the snow like old bones. If there was a guard, I couldn't see him. I made my way to the cars. The one I wanted was in the back row. A Ziguli. It was dark green, but at night it would be hard to tell from the one I was driving. Its owner must have tried to drive it through a brick wall. The front end was a twisted mess, the grille ripped right away, and a piece of cardboard was taped over the windshield. But bending down, I saw that the front license plate was intact and hanging by only a single bolt. Rather than try to unscrew it, I just levered hard with the screwdriver, one ugly screech, until it popped free. I went around to the back. Here the damage wasn't so bad, though the trunk lid was off its hinges and jammed inside. I set to work with the screwdriver. One of the bolts was a little rusted, but in 90 seconds I had it off, and with both plates shoved under my coat, I headed back to the gate. No one had seen me. In 20 minutes the snow would have covered my tracks, and it might be days before anyone noticed the missing plates. Even then, the assumption would be that someone had taken them off and put them away for safekeeping. I returned to my car. Sitting there with its hood up and the door still open, it seemed part of the landscape. Already the windshield was covered with snow. I slipped inside, shoving the plates under the seat. Then I lit a cigarette and started the engine, though my door remained open and the pantomime still wasn't over. I let the engine warm, finished my cigarette, turned on the wipers, waited as they carved 2 perfect arcs in the night. At last, getting out, I slapped the hood back into place, and this time, getting back in, I pulled the door shut behind me. But both my coming and going had been so slow and gradual that I felt sure neither would have been noticed. I edged into the road. A mile away, turning into a side street, I pulled up at the curb, and 10 minutes later, despite the cold and my clumsy fingers, one Ziguli had vanished and another had taken its place. I had disappeared, the car had disappeared. For one night at least, I could enjoy the greatest freedom, or horror, conceivable in a totalitarian country. I had no official identity. But I knew this freedom would be very brief. I had to make quick use of it. I sped south through the city. In an odd way now, my plans depended on my being seen at least a couple of times by the police, so I kept to main roads. Back to the Nevsky, past Alexander's Palace, onto a Barony Prospect, then on toward Route 22. Here, at the junction, was a GAI post, the yellow light of its interior floating high over the road. I dutifully slowed. The GAI are a Soviet equivalent to the Highway Patrol. They cruise around in yellow cars and man observation posts along the highways. Some of these are small, but others, like the one I pass now, are high towers. Inside, they would take down my license and conceivably transmit it to the next post in line. And I wanted them to. Tomorrow, when my car was posted missing, these records would be checked. And as long as its license, or the unidentified Zuguli, didn't appear, everyone would assume I was still somewhere in Leningrad. As I accelerated away from the post, the road opened up. On either side was the blackness of the subarctic night. But in front of me, trapped in the headlights, was a blizzard of gold. The wind rocked the little car, and after half an hour my arms ached from the task of holding it steady. But the road was level and reasonably straight. I kept the speedometer at 90 kilometers per hour, and the miles unwound. There was little to see in the blackness, just the snow heaped up on empty fields or around the rim of the forest, but I knew I was traveling along the southern edge of Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in all Europe, and occasionally the void beyond the car took on a limitless sheen. There were one or two towns, Novia Ladoga, Perevoz, Lodinoye Polye. But at Olyonets, the road swung north and east, across country, 5 a.m. Now I was into Karelia, a stubby finger of rock and bush that sticks up between the Finnish border and the Arctic seas. It's a desolate land of rocks, trees, lakes, tumbling rivers, and waterfalls, whose towns are depots for pitheads and lumber camps. A lot of it was once part of Finland, and though almost 500,000 Finns left when the Russians invaded, East Finnish is still spoken here, and I saw it printed on the occasional sign. I was tired by now, my shoulders ached and my eyes burned a little. But then at Praza, where a smaller road joined the one I was on, I fell in behind a couple of lumber trucks and gave them the task of finding the way. There were 3 of them, empty, traveling in convoy. Huge black chains used to strap the logs on jostled and jounced on their long, flat beds, and I followed their thumping music through the wind, the night, and the snow into Petrozavodsk. Sitting on the edge of Lake Onega, the second largest lake in all Europe, this is the capital of the Karelian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, KASSR. About 200,000 people live there. In imperial times, it was called the Near Siberia, because people from Petersburg convicted of minor offenses were often exiled here. But now, in its administrative center, has the regulation tractor factory and boasts something of a tourist industry based on hydrofoil service that runs to Kizi Island, with its ancient wooden church out in the lake. But there'd be no boat trips today. As a gray, bleary dawn streaked the horizon, I could see that the low, snow-covered shore merged with the ice on the lake in an unbroken white plain, and only far, far out was there a dark sparkle from the open water. Sticking close to the trucks, I cut through the western edge of the city. Soon we rejoined the highway. There was more traffic now, and although the snow was letting up, enough had fallen for some drifting to start. I cut back my speed. The next 50 kilometers to Kondopoga took almost an hour. Shortly afterward, around 9:30, the trucks turned away down a side road. But now I had no need of a guide. The road led only one way, due north. It was the single track through an almost trackless waste. To my right was the pure white desolation of the lake. On my left, endless fir and pine forest, the thick purple boughs of the trees pressed low by the fresh white snow. With only an occasional glimpse of a railway line for company, I kept on, beating the miles into submission. Finally, I won total victory. Medvyezhegorsk, with 20,000 people or so, was the last sizable spot on the line. And then came Piandushi, a small village perched on the long icy bay jutting in from the lake. After that, the road swung inland through bush, scrub, cut over land. I rumbled over a bridge. 2 or 3 kilometers went by, then the road narrowed, snowbanks pinching in, and finally I could see a scattering of dark buildings along the rocky shore of the white, limitless lake. There was no sign. Like myself, the place was anonymous. But I knew this was Pavanets, home of the man who'd inherited Harry Brightman's strange fortune. I eased back on the gas. All at once I felt very tired. I'd come a long way. I only hoped that this was the end of the line.